Good afternoon, everyone. It is 4 p.m. ET, and I am Hank Phillippi Ryan, and this is Tuesday, and now you're fully oriented to we are at A Mighty Mystery, the place for mysteries on a mighty blaze, and we welcome you all today. We are I have and we will have the joy of interviewing Wiley Cash today. It is his launch day for this gorgeous, brilliant, and I mean absolutely brilliant and unmissable When Ghosts Come Home. This is a book. It is gorgeous. It is Thomas Wolfe and Harper Lee and every person you love. It is heartbreaking and gorgeous and unmissable. And I'm so honored to be able to talk to Wiley on his launch day today. I know I'm talking to you as if you're not there, Wiley, but welcome, welcome, welcome to
Well,
this.
my blushing is definitely here. You mentioning those names, I was like, oh, Hank.
Well, no, I mean, it's true. And I want to talk to you about that because there is a gorgeous lyricism of your books and also this spare dialogue woven together in an incredibly special story. And I want you to talk about that a little bit this afternoon, not just about the story, but how you did it and your influences and all those wonderful things. Where are you, by the way?
I am in Asheville, North Carolina, on the campus of the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where I teach fiction writing and literature. We're having the launch just a few steps away here on campus tonight, and Malaprops from Asheville, a great independent bookstore, is going to be on hand to sell books.
And we have the Malaprops link in our comments. And if you would like a signed copy of When Ghosts Come Home, which you do, listeners, trust me, you want this. You can click right on that link and get a copy. Wiley, you were telling me earlier about your launch event tonight, which is kind of crazy.
It is. We're, really releasing a book during a global pandemic is kind of a tricky thing to do. And while I really want to sell books and I really want to get in front of readers and talk about this book and take questions, because I love doing that, as I know you do as well, Hank. I wanted to make sure that we were keeping everybody safe. So
Mm.
at all my events on this book tour, masks are required. Most of my events are being held outside. And here on the campus of UNC Asheville, the event is being held on the floor of the basketball arena. So you can guarantee there is going to be plenty of room for social distancing. And I'm thrilled that the lead singer and songwriter of the Grammy Award-winning band Steep Canyon Rangers is going to be with me playing some music. And then he and I will talk a little bit about being Southern writers and fathers and all of those things and how that comes to bear on our work. So it's going to be a lot of fun in about 3 hours.
That's incredibly exciting. And I'm trying to picture that. I'm trying to picture you in a basketball arena
Yeah.
filled with people who are enthusiastic about your book and about his music. And what a joyful and wonderful achievement this book is. Let me take 2 seconds just to introduce you all to Mighty Mysteries and A Mighty Blaze. If you don't know A Mighty Blaze, it is this marvelous sort of literary television, Facebook, YouTube event put together by the powerhouse team of Jenna Blum and Caroline Levitt at the beginning of the pandemic to bring us together and keep us talking about books and reading and discover new authors and new books. And it has gone on and it has continued to blaze as the pandemic continues. And I know we will all be here, all 37 volunteers of us will be here after the pandemic is over. So thank you for being here today. If you are new to A Mighty Blaze, hooray, you have picked a wonderful day to be here. If you are a veteran blazer, like I see so many of you, Anissa and Sherry and Gail coming today, and so many others. Oh, thank you. So nice to see all your comments. We have quite a treat for you. Let me quickly introduce Wiley Cash. Wiley Cash is the award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of novels including A Land More Kind Than Home and The Last Ballad. A winner and finalist for numerous prizes, he is the founder of the Open Canon Book Club and serves as writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He lives in North Carolina with his wife and their two daughters. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I'm going to finally let you talk, Wiley, in about 10 seconds. So here is this gorgeous book out today, When Ghosts Come Home. And I'll say one line about it, and then you tell however much more you want to tell. As a sort of mystery, you decide how much you want to give away. So it begins in 1984, very fraught year, with a middle-aged sheriff awakened by the sound of an airplane landing in an airfield outside the house where he and his wife lived, kind of middle of the night. And then you go.
That's a great setup. It is. This aircraft, he knows it is too late at night for an aircraft of that size to be flying that low over his house. And so he goes out to the airfield. It's a little municipal airfield. It's actually a grass runway, a turf runway, as they call it. And there's no reason for a plane that large to be on a runway like this. And he goes out there in the middle of the night with his flashlight. He looks around, and what he discovers shocks him and changes the course not only of his life, but the life of this small town of Oak Island off the coast of North Carolina, just south of Wilmington. On the runway is a crash-landed DC-3. It's a World War II era cargo plane. It has landed on the runway and tried to turn around to stop from running off of the runway, and the rear landing gear has snapped. There is nothing inside the plane. It's been completely abandoned. Later, they will not even be able to recover fingerprints from the interior of the aircraft. But then alongside the plane is the body of a local man shot dead and left behind. So the sheriff has two mysteries on his hands. Who flew this aircraft and what's it doing here? And what, if any, role did this local guy play in this plane's arrival?
Well, as I have said endlessly, it is such a good book. Your main character, Sheriff Winston Barnes. Tell us, I mean, he's perfect. He's perfectly drawn in this book. He is so lovely and so complicated, and so loving and so conflicted. Tell us a little bit about where he came from and how he evolved as your main character.
That's a great question. I don't necessarily know where he came from, because I wish I did, because I would be able to, kind of reverse engineer the conjuring of characters more easily than it is sometimes, as I know you know well, Hank, trying to put books together and bring characters to life. But when I had the idea of a plane crash in the middle of the night, I knew there would have to be some kind of law enforcement element. And then the question becomes, well, is the law enforcement element noble, or is it, evil in some way? Is it
corrupt in some way?
Corrupt, exactly. That's a better word. Corrupt is a better word, especially when you're talking about mysterious airplanes flying off the coast of the southern United States in the mid 1980s. And when I decided that the sheriff was going to be, or try to be, a decent person, I tried to complicate his life in the ways that all of our lives are complicated. He has pressures from his family. His wife is very sick. He's afraid of losing his reelection because they'll lose their health insurance. His daughter is nursing a tragic wound in her recent past, and she arrives home out of nowhere. She's 25 years old. She's kind of a woman without a country. And then he's facing this tough reelection battle. So he's got all these pressures inside of his family, and then all these pressures from his community. And he's someone doing his best and trying his hardest to do the right thing. But more often than not, in these small towns, the right thing and the legal thing are not always the same. And the sheriff finds himself in a lot of situations in which he feels very conflicted about what to do.
One of the wonderful things about Winston is that you bring him and his wife to the town. They didn't grow up there. They didn't live there. They're outsiders. And just like we, the reader, he's trying to feel his way through the politics and the people and the personalities and the edginess and the burbling emotions under everything. It's also the setting. I mean, you talked about that this big DC-3, way too big for the runway, is an outsider and comes in as a mystery. Mm-hmm. And Winston is sort of a mystery himself. Talk a little bit about the sort of milieu of where it takes place.
Well, I love how you framed it as he is an outsider and the aircraft is also an outsider. And when we think about local color, and we think about especially late 19th, early 20th century local color writers like Paul Laurence Dunbar, Kate Chopin, or Mark Twain especially, almost all of those local color stories are about an outsider coming to the inside and trying to take something, whether it be custom, food, people, And so I was thinking about outsiders and insiders, and that automatic tension that the outsider comes to bear. You know, Winston's been in the county, Brunswick County, on the coast, the southeast coast of North Carolina, I think for 15 to 20 years, but he's still an outsider forever, you know, and he doesn't know these deep set traditional perceptions of race and class that really pervade this small community. And although he is the law is very different than social customs and cultures. And he's trying to navigate that constantly.
And talking about the outsider again and the navigation of the balance, let's go to the back a little. Go back to the title again. You know, when ghosts come home, I keep thinking of lost and by the wind grieved.
Oh, wow.
Ghosts come back again, and it is, we all are haunted. Everyone is haunted by something, and sometimes those memories and what you did in the past can come back to haunt you, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's not good. Talk a little bit about where that title came from.
Well, I got to tell you, Hank, now that I'm sitting in Asheville, North Carolina, it means a lot to me to hear you quote Thomas Wolfe on a national broadcast like this. That's absolutely wonderful. And Thomas Wolfe is one of my favorite writers. He had a big influence on me in proving that the place you are from is worth literature. The place you call home is worth literature. Not so much a stylistic influence, but certainly that kind of metaphysical, spiritual influence that a lot of writers do. But all of the characters in this novel are haunted by ghosts one way or another, whether it be the ghost of class, the ghost of race, the ghost of gender, the way these things hang on our backs and weigh us down, you know, and when we are haunted because things have been left undone. Things have been left unaddressed. Things have been left unfixed or unnoticed or unrequited. And Winston has things in his past that come to bear on him, decisions he's made that haunt him. And all of these characters do at one moment or another. And this is a novel that shows that these ghosts do come home, and they do come for you, and they do confront you, and they do make you deal with them, whether you want to or not.
I mean, it's interesting. Let me just read you a tiny little paragraph. You can see all my bookmarks in this. And it's something that, talking about the past, it's something that his daughter, Connie, says when they are visiting a neighborhood, a Black neighborhood. Connie, his daughter. I'm sorry, Colleen. Colleen, his daughter. You're like, Connie, who is that? Colleen, his daughter. I see that right here. And so she's in her 20s, and she's come home. She has this problem that she's trying to get over, and she's come home unexpectedly. And she goes with her father to this Black neighborhood, which I won't tell the reason. Colleen couldn't remember if she had ever been in the Grove before. Had she ever had a reason? She'd had Black friends when she was young, playing softball and other sports, seeing them at a few birthday parties when they were little, or after school events like plays or dances or club meetings. But she couldn't remember ever having been inside one of the Black kids' homes. No play dates or sleepovers or things like that. And then she realized that none of the Black kids she'd grown up with had ever been inside her home either. And here she was, a grown woman at 25, going to visit a widow inside the home of a Black classmate who'd been shot and killed. The mysteries of life always seemed vague and inexplicable to Colleen, and as her father drove past the small brick and clapboard homes, their yards alive with flowers and ornaments and outdoor furniture or choked with weeds, she couldn't help but question the predestined vagaries of fate that had landed her here. And you see that when you see the world another way, when something is open to you, and those, you know, she didn't even realize that her idea of race and class and separateness were that. But when she started to deal with someone as a real person, that a whole new world opened up for her.
Yeah, and also a whole new assessment of what she thought her life was. You know, before that moment, Colleen probably would have looked back on her life and felt that it was completely integrated. Like, I went to a public school, I saw Black kids all the time. But when she's about to go into someone's home, it makes her stop. Have I ever done this before? Did I ever go into his home when we were kids? Did his friends or ever come into mine? And these are the things these are these little mysteries of life and these vagaries of fate that are mentioned in the book, that if we're honest with ourselves, there are so many opportunities for us throughout our lives on an almost daily basis to stop and sit somewhere and be still and say, and ask, how did I end up here? What are the moments that led to this one? And I'm about to enter a new space. I'm about to do something I've never done before. And why have I not done it before?
And those questions are so difficult to answer and so personally and soulfully challenging that if you do face them and you can come out the other side, they are endlessly life changing. I mean, one of the glories of this book is, clearly it's a mystery, what happened with the plane and what happened with the person who was killed and who's behind it all and how could this possibly have been. But it's also these opposing forces at work throughout: the husband and wife, and the father and the daughter, and the father and son, and mother and daughter, all, these everyday relationships colored by race and class and politics and obsession and fear, all those kinds of things. The conflict is just so brilliant throughout. How conscious are you of the necessity for those kinds of moments to drive the story forward?
That's a great question. I think that when it comes to relationships between characters, I'm a pretty conscious writer, because I'm always looking for the little pressure points where things are tense. And I'm always asking the question, why don't the mother and daughter want to talk about this? How does the father feel when the daughter brings up that? And I'm always looking for those things. And I mean, that's what happens to us, when we sit down at Thanksgiving or Christmas, when we talk about things like vaccines or January 6th, or any number of things. Half the table's like, oh, why'd you have to bring this up? And the other half of the table's raring to go, one side or the other. And these tough conversations along the lines of politics and race and culture, that's what can make a family become cohesive, or it can be what drives them apart. And both of those things will happen if they're not addressed. These tough conversations and these awkward realizations, like the one you pointed out that Colleen has. If we're honest with ourselves, we can have more of that.
But it's also, one of your blurbs, let me just read you this. One of your blurbs, as if you haven't read it, one of your blurbs from Jess Walter, who's one of my favorite authors of all time, calls this book Harper Lee by way of Elmore Leonard. And I see that from the nostalgia and the southernness of Harper Lee and the sort of criminal element but spare dialogue of Elmore Leonard. But also it reminds me a little bit, and forgive me, how my brain works, it reminds me a little bit of Thornton Wilder as well, a little bit of Our Town, how ordinary people, everyday people, saying everyday things to each other, and yet it is just endlessly heartbreaking. You seem like you're just having your everyday life, but underneath that are ghosts and history and hopes and fears and dreams and fate and inevitability. But we don't face that. We just say, hey, how are you? I'm fine. And does that touch you at all? Do you see what I mean about the Our Townness of it?
It does. I think you're absolutely right. And I'm really interested in small towns and rural spaces. I'm really interested in the mystery of life in these places. When I read a writer like Ashley Bryant Phillips, who's from Eastern North Carolina, who writes beautifully about small town life. You mentioned Thornton Wilder, Sherwood Anderson, and all these mysteries, this under the surface struggles that people have. I'm thinking about like Olive Kitteridge or a novel like that. They're just taking people that you would pass by on the street and not think of them as remarkable people, but they are remarkable people. And I was thinking about this very thing today, Hank. I was having lunch downtown Asheville, And I was, feeling nervous, and I've got this event tonight. I knew I was doing this event with you, and just feeling kind of nervous and jittery. Today's launch day, and I don't know how it's going to go. And today may make or break the trajectory of the book, all the pressures you put on yourself. And at the restaurant I was at, it was like this big open space and kind of an outdoor space. There was a guy waiting tables, and it was his first day. And I sensed in him the way he was carrying himself and the questions he was asking about how to work the computer and all this really difficult stuff that I remember doing when I waited tables. I sensed an incredible kinship in him. And I was thinking, I have more in common with this guy right now than probably anybody I can lay eyes on that I know, right? We're experiencing the same levels of fear and uncertainty and performance anxiety, and we don't want to let anybody down. And this is my first day, and I'm really hoping it goes well. And I think if we look at stuff like that and we appreciate the mystery of life for what it is, we will find kinships in those moments that will allow us to have these tough conversations.
And that's heartbreaking too. And you see that is that one of the problems is that sometimes we get so involved and self-centered, and we think it's all about us. And then if just one little moment like that reveals so much. For better or for worse. I mean, there is a blockbuster scene in the middle of this book that I just stopped me in my tracks. I mean, I honestly just sort of had to put the book down after I had read it. The conversation in the sheriff's office with, is she a receptionist or office manager or something like that? And it's just this step-by-step revelation of a thing. And I want you to talk about that if you can. And
Sure.
I was going to read some of it, but I want people just to read it themselves because it's just so good. I'm trying to think of a better word than good, but it's just
Thank you, Hank. That's big praise coming from you. And the online magazine Bitter Southerner is publishing that excerpt on Thursday. It'll be available online on bittersoutherner.com on Thursday. With an essay that I wrote.
We can talk about it a little bit because
absolutely. With an essay I wrote about that scene, and I'd love to talk about it because. Well, I'll talk about the scene first, and then I'll talk about what I was trying to do. So there's a point in the novel. The sheriff is facing a tough re-election battle, and his challenger is this local developer. He's the son of a rich guy. He's, kind of a soft-handed daddy's boy who's never really worked before, and he wants to be sheriff. And when this plane lands and there's a black man left dead on the runway, he ties that to suspicion of drugs, right? That drugs are coming into the community, all of this stuff. And he plays upon these white supremacist sympathies. And so there's a scene in the novel where the sheriff's challenger, his name is Bradley Fry, goes on a night ride in the black community, which is called the Grove. And he flies the Confederate flag with a bunch of his buddies in trucks and other vehicles. They shoot off guns. They have spotlights shining them into homes. And a resident of the Grove calls a sheriff's deputy, and the guy gets out there really late. And it's all kind of died down by now. And it's this very disappointing investigation into this night ride. And so the next day, there are numerous calls placed to the sheriff's office about this night ride and what's the sheriff going to do about it. And then eventually a man from the Grove, who happens to be the father of the deceased man who's found on the runway, his name is Ed Bellamy. He's a local high school teacher. He's a black civil rights leader in town. He shows up in the sheriff's office and he says, what's going on? I've been calling you all day, and you're not willing to confront this racial terror happening in my community. And the sheriff says, I don't know what you're talking about. And he discovers that his secretary, a woman he's known for 2 decades, didn't give him these messages. Because he goes out and he confronts her. And it's this very awkward back and forth exchange where they're slowly revealing to one another where their sympathies and ideas of justice lie. And at one point, the secretary says, I didn't give you those messages because there's no law against riding around. And it reminded me of many things we've heard in the very recent past. Lines like, I'm the least racist person you could ever meet, right? How we can do things and then use language to condition them as if they weren't what they were. And when the sheriff's secretary says there is no law against driving or against riding around, the sheriff understands that something between them has shifted. Their relationship will never be the same. There will never be casual, thoughtless niceties. Everything will be surface. There will never be casual, friendly interactions between them ever again. And that was, you know, all novels that I try to write begin with a feeling that I know I want a book to feel. And that's how I wanted this book. I knew I wanted to hit that emotional note at some point in the book, because we've all been hitting that for the past 5 or 6 years. We've been hitting this note where we come up against these awkward interactions with people we think we know. And it may be a revelation like, oh my God, you think QAnon's real? Or, oh, you don't believe vaccines work? Oh, you don't believe that kids should wear masks in school?
And you never think about them the same way again. It's all as if there's a filter over it or a veil over it. But the way that you handle this so gorgeously, Wiley, is that you make it small, really, really small, in this one interaction between these two people, but then you show that it's also huge. And I am going to just treat you all by reading this little part. Winston says, I need you, Winston said, not to be on my side, but to be on the side of the law. I have to know I can trust you, okay? Okay, she said. She scooted her chair even closer to the desk and cast her eyes back down at her work. A storm had passed between them, destroying every structure in sight and ripping trees from the earth. But neither of them would ever acknowledge the carnage, choosing instead to live exposed to the elements in silence. So, you rip up their lives, and with this beautiful description of nature, that nature has been disturbed, and yet they still are not going to acknowledge it. They're still going to go ahead and pretend that everything is okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we do that so often, and I think especially in the South. One of my dearest friends was a writer named Jason Mott, who wrote a gorgeous novel called Hell of a Book. Was just longlisted for the National Book Award on Friday, and I'm super excited for him. It's completely deserving. But there's a scene in the novel where a guy comes back to North Carolina, a Black author who's coming home from book tour, and he says, "I'm landing in North Carolina. The South is America's longest running crime scene." Then in the next paragraph, he says, "Despite all of this, I love the South." And so we need to get used to the idea, whether a region or a state or a country, that we can hold two ideas in our heads at the same time. We can hold the idea of the reality that I agree the South is America's longest running crime scene, because crime scenes stay up until investigations are solved and the evidence is collected. There's a lot of investigations in the South that have never been even looked into, much less solved. So the crime scene's still active, but you can still love the South. Those two things can exist side by side. And so when Winston has this interaction with Vicky, it's the awkwardness, the uncertainty, and really the repulsion of seeing the reality of somebody and forcing yourself to try to hold the idea of she is condoning racial terror, and I work with her and see her every day. Yeah. It's hard to hold those side by side. So
and that he had worked with her every day, that he had worked with her
for decades.
He didn't know that, and he didn't know that. He didn't see that. And then, because you are so good, you turn the page and the prism flips, and it's the other side of the story. It's someone from the other side of the story having a really parallel scene, which ends in a different way. Talk a little bit about that, if you will.
With Ed Bellamy and the sheriff?
Yeah.
So Winston goes back into his office where this incensed man feels completely forsaken by the law. His son's been murdered. He doesn't know why. He doesn't believe his son was involved in drugs. His neighborhood's been terrorized. Houses are being shot at. Windows are being broken. And the sheriff comes back in and makes a big show of calling the deputy from the night before and firing him over the phone because he didn't file a report about the night ride, right? And the sheriff hangs up the phone as if racism's over. I've done my job. And Ed Bellamy, who is a Vietnam War veteran, he was a sniper in the Vietnam War, he's a civil rights leader, he's just lost his son. He has to essentially take Winston by the hand and walk him through the legacy of racial horror and terror, because it's not as easy as firing a deputy who doesn't investigate a crime. It's not that easy. But for as chivalrous as Winston shows himself to be with the secretary and standing up to her, he comes back and does the easy thing in the office. And so I did that to show that although Winston's our hero, it is really hard to be somebody who does the right thing all the time.
And I know you're going to think this is a crazy comparison, but it also reminds me of the end of Murder on the Orient Express, because Poirot, I won't say what it is, Poirot solves the crime of the Murder on the Orient Express. And he's sort of law enforcement, and he knows what he should do at the end. He knows what he should do. That would be the legal, judicial, law enforcement thing to do. And yet, I can say, I guess, that he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He decides, he makes his personal moral decision of what justice means. And that juggle has always fascinated me. That story has always fascinated me because it doesn't end the way you think it would end. And Winston is trying to make these decisions along the way of what's in his own heart and what he needs to do as a law enforcement officer, and faced with this huge racial gap. I mean, this growing and growing and growing. It's 1984, remember? So think about what that was like. No, I know, Hank, well, you never thought about that. How does he face this reality that is relentless, and could steamroll him when he thought he was a good guy?
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges that he faces in the book. And I really love complicated characters and complicated situations. And there's so much energy and tension and pressure in characters like that just reverberates out and can feed a narrative. And Winston is somebody who has done things that he really regrets in his past. And he kind of picks back through some of his actions, and he finds himself asking, did I do that because I had preconceived ideas about, whoever this person was? And am I fleeing the bad decision that I made? Am I responsible for the bad decisions that I've made? And at the same time, there are so many instances in the novel where he overlooks the ways in which perhaps the women in his life, namely his daughter Colleen, could really assist him in making sense of all the complications that are lying at his feet. But again, as you said, because it's 1984, and because Winston's a middle-aged man who's a sheriff and powerful, he dismisses all of those things.
We'll have questions for you in a minute, but when you finally finished this book, and I assume it went through some incarnations along the way, did you know how it would end?
No, gosh. I started this book. My last novel was called The Last Ballad. It was about a mill strike in my hometown in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1929. And that book took a ton of research. It took me a long time to write it. And I would take a break from that novel and I would work on this short story about this mysterious airplane. And then that short story grew to 80 pages or so. And it just got, untenable in terms of being a short story. And so I kind of set it aside. But I had Winston's character. And then once his daughter revealed herself to be as interesting as I found her to be, I knew I had kind of a polarity, the thinky person and the feeling person. That's kind of how this novel I thought was going to go. That Winston was going to rationalize and Colleen was going to intuit. Winston was going to think and Colleen was going to feel. And who was going to end up being correct about whatever these mysteries are in the novel. But I didn't know how it was going to end, Hank. And it wasn't up until really late in the editing process that it revealed itself that it was going to have this great turn. This is the first, I'm so proud to be on this podcast with you, but this is the first mystery I've written, real mystery, because to me, mysteries are so complicated. There's so many levers and traps and springs and doors to plan and plot so far in advance. And I am just not that kind of thinker. And that's never been my strength. And so when I stumbled into this mystery with these big reveals and these turns, I thought, this is what it feels like to think you're smart, and I just kind of reveled in it. But I wish I could say that I came by it honestly with this mystery, but I didn't. It was just these characters.
No, I never know the ending of my books. I never know, because how do I know until it happens?
Yeah.
The book has to evolve, and the story has to take place, and people have to make decisions, and you don't always know what those decisions are going to be until they make them, and then you think, oh, okay. But the key of a good mystery ending, which you have nailed, is that from page one, that is what it has to be. But the author can't know that until the revisions happen. Every single page is filled with foreboding. Every single piece is tied up at the end and fits and works. It's just really brilliant. It's just really good with this template of race over these personal relationships, which my final question maybe is that how much of a risk did you think it was to tread in that territory?
First of all, the praise about the mystery means a lot coming from you, Hank. So thank you so much for saying that. But writing about race is something that I've done a couple of times, not maybe to this depth. My last novel had a strong racial component about, Black labor organizing in the 1920s. But to make it this immediate and this resonant of contemporary issues, that's my first time doing that. And I have my only hesitation when it comes to doing something outside of my own experience or whatever the case may be, is I just don't want to get it wrong. But I do the best work I can. I think deeply. I read broadly. I spend a lot of time. And if I get it wrong, I'll have to deal with it. But also, I'm from the South. I'm from North Carolina, and I write novels set in North Carolina. And if I don't tell the whole story, then I'm doing a disservice to my community, to history, to the truth. And for a novel like this one to tell the whole story, I had to do just that.
Of course. And it's shiveringly, authentically, gorgeously good.
Thank you.
And it's just riveting. I have said this too much in this interview, but I want you all to know, listening, that this is a book not to be missed, When Ghosts Come Home by Wiley Cash. If we have questions, I'd love to see what you all, Marjorie, hi, from Finland, says, what has been the best piece of advice you have received as an author?
I had the great honor and privilege to study under one of the writers who had the greatest influence on me, and that's a writer named Ernest Gaines, who was born in Louisiana. He's a Black writer from Southwest Louisiana. He wrote A Lesson Before Dying and other books that I find to be iconic works of American fiction. And he said if he had 6 words of advice for a writer, it would be read, 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 write, write, write. And if he had 8 words of advice for a writer, it would be read, 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 write, 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 write. And that's something that I've always taken very, very seriously, is to read and to read actively. Francine Prose has a great book called Reading Like a Writer. And that's what I try to do. I read with a pen in hand. I make notes. I dog ear pages. I totally desecrate books, because while I'm reading them, I'm taking them apart and trying to figure out how they work. I'm completely capable of disappearing into a story. I can do that, but I can do both at once. It's like walking into a building and asking yourself, how does this building stand? How does this building operate as a structure? And that's what I do whenever I read.
I mean, it's funny because I will tell you, I did a TEDx talk about it actually, is that sometimes I read the ends of books first, and then I go back and read the beginning, so I can deconstruct how they got there.
Yeah,
there are so many things in good books that the authors have done that you don't notice. One doesn't notice because you're racing through the story to see what happens. And if you go back, you see, oh, that's what they did. That's what that meant. That was what that metaphor was. That wasn't casual. Oh, that was a clue. But if we don't have time to read books twice, I read the first chapter, then I read the last chapter, then I go back and start again. Don't do this at home, ladies and gentlemen. Do not do that with this book. Do not do it with my book. Find some other book. But it is a way, as you say, Wiley, exactly, of untangling the architecture to see how it got put back together. It's kind of cool. Kind of cool. Who else has a question, if anyone? What is your favorite genre to read, says our darling Sherry.
What is my favorite genre to read? I read a lot of nonfiction, interestingly enough. I read a lot of everything, but I've been on a nonfiction kind of tear lately. I was telling them in the virtual green room that I just got Anderson Cooper's new book about the Vanderbilts, and it's super juicy and gossipy. I'm already about 50 pages into it. I read it over lunch. But I read a lot of nonfiction, but I read a lot of fiction. Recently, I've been reading a lot of fiction by women. I'm reading the new novel, The Love Songs of W.B. Du Bois, which is breathtaking. I'm actually doing the audio, which is 30 hours of just joy because I spend a lot of time in the car and will continue to now that I'm on book tour. And a couple of other books that I've really loved lately, a new novel called Virtue by Hermione Hobie. I read The Immortalist by Chloe Benjamin. I'm kind of late to that novel. I really loved that one. I've read some really great books lately. Feeling really lucky to have that experience.
I've heard that the pandemic, for all the hideousness, continuing hideousness, has somehow given birth to a lot of really wonderful books. I'm feeling the same thing, reading all these great things coming out of this. So that is pretty interesting. Who else has a question? We're running out of time. So is there one more question? If not, what are you working on next? Oh, Wiley is working on joy. Wiley is working on the joy of book launch day. Let him get through the day without that question. But I mean, what are you working on?
I've got another North Carolina novel that I'm about 20,000 words into, but not quite ready to talk about just yet. Still kind of living in the headspace of Winston and Colleen and all the characters from When Ghosts Come Home.
Well, they will be beloved and immortal and read and discussed and talked about. And on broadcasts like this, when other authors are asked, what are they reading? They will say, Wiley Cash, When Ghosts Come Home. It is fabulous. It is wonderful. And we wish you the happiest of launch days. I know we're picking a winner of your book. And if we haven't posted that winner yet, there it is. Look at that.
All right.
Yay, Allie.
Congratulations.
Allie from Canada. Wonderfully generous, fabulous person, Allie. I cannot wait to send this to you. You will love it. Wiley, congratulations on your
Thank you so much.
Day. Much joy and many blessings. And to all of you who are listening today, thank you so much for coming to Mighty Mysteries. Oh, let me tell you, next week, look at this. Amanda Giatis says, my sweet girl, look at that cover.
It's a beautiful amazing cover.
Isn't it? And this is so chilling and so haunting and so creepy. I read it a couple of weeks ago, and there are a couple of scenes that I am still thinking about. So highly, highly recommended. A debut novel. Amanda lives in Sri Lanka, and she's fantastic. This is a great book. Do not miss it. Wiley Cash, happy Pub Day.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. We will see you next Tuesday at 4 p.m.